Welcome back to The World This Week with me, Jonathan Steele. Under American law, a person can only be detained for 120 days before being brought to trial. 25-year-old Bradley Manning has spent 8 times that length of time in jail, and last month the judge ruled that his inhumane treatment for part of that period was illegal. Manning is the alleged source of a Wikileaks exposure on US activities in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as the publication of a huge trove of diplomatic cables in 2010. He's currently attending a pre-trial hearing. Charlotte Hawkins has more, but I must say this report does contain graphic footage.
Free Bradley Manning! Free Bradley Manning! Free
US Army Private Bradley Manning is accused of leaking state secrets to Wikileaks. Last weekend marked his 1,000th day in detention without trial. While based in Iraq, Manning allegedly leaked confidential war logs, diaries and diplomatic cables to the online organisation. These were later published by various media outlets, causing outrage and embarrassment. Manning is also accused of leaking a video supposedly showing American forces firing on civilians and Reuters reporters in Baghdad. The video was released by Wikileaks under the name Collateral Murder.
Hey, we need to stop that so we can get down there.
Shoot. Roger. Break. Crazy Horse 1A. Request permission to engage. I'm picking up the wounded. Yeah, we're trying to get permission to engage. Come on, let us shoot. Bushmaster, Crazy Horse 1A. We're taking him. Bushmaster, Crazy Horse 1A.
You're engaged.
1A, engage. Clear. Come on. Clear.
When Manning was found to be the alleged source of the leak, he was arrested and kept in solitary confinement for 9 months.
Brad's treatment at Quantico will forever be etched, I believe, in our nation's history as a disgraceful moment in time.
Many have stood up for Manning's actions and championed him for exposing war crimes. They are calling for his release. However, many others say the leak put soldiers and informants in danger, and for this, the US government views Manning as having betrayed his country.
Knowing that this man who these people are protesting for put my husband's life in danger, put my husband's friends' lives in danger. It's frustrating.
The military believed that the leaked information was accessed by Al-Qaeda, and Manning could face the death penalty if convicted of aiding the enemy. However, the prosecution are pursuing a sentence of life imprisonment. Julian Assange, founder of Wikileaks, also faces possible prosecution in the United States for publishing the information. He remains inside the Ecuadorian embassy in London and unable to leave without being arrested and potentially facing extradition to the USA.
The United States of America, will it return to and reaffirm the values, the revolutionary values it was founded on? Or will it lurch off the precipice, dragging us all into a dangerous and oppressive world in which journalists fall silent under the fear of prosecution and citizens must whisper in the dark? I say it must turn back.
WikiLeaks and Manning's alleged actions have polarised public opinion. Are they heroes or traitors? And the question over protecting whistleblowers still remains.
The US administration's war on whistleblowers must end.
The military are keen to prevent Manning's defence team from discussing a whistleblowing motive in court until sentencing. The trial is due to start in June. Charlotte Hawkins, Islam Channel.
Well, the US government is planning to call 141 witnesses to the trial, including 15 who will testify that the leaked information caused harm to US national interests. Joining me in the studio to discuss Manning's case and the protection of whistleblowers in general are David Leigh, Investigations Executive Editor at The Guardian newspaper, Naomi Colvin, founder of UK Friends of Bradley Manning, And joining me on the phone from North Carolina in the United States is Professor David Schanzer from Duke University, who is director of the Triangle Center on Terrorism and Homeland Security. Welcome to you all. Well, David, let me turn to you first as a journalist. It is, as we said at the beginning, 1,000 days since Bradley Manning was arrested, and yet there was almost no coverage at all of that grim anniversary in the British media, or indeed in the American media. But why is that? Has he been forgotten?
I think one of the problems is that the plight of Bradley Manning has been overshadowed by the drama, if not the melodrama, about Wikileaks and the flight and the plight of Julian Assange. Everyone's been very excited about that, and Bradley Manning's been a bit overshadowed as a result. I think that's the problem.
Well, let me put the same question to you, David Schanzer. In the US media, I looked up on the New York Times website. There was no mention of the 1,000 days he spent in detention. Why has he been forgotten, would you say?
Well, in the United States, we have a short attention span, and whatever is, of the moment, budget crises. We had an election not all that long ago, and frankly, there's really nothing happening. There's nothing to report. So the media, doesn't really have much of a hook to say, well, there's no pictures, there's nobody talking. So until the trial, I'm sure it will get attention when the trial comes, but until then, it's a very light story.
Well, Naomi, Colvin, let me turn to you now on the whole national security thing. You saw on the clip the woman, the spouse of a Marine, saying that he'd caused her husband's death and so on. Do you think that the leaks were as serious as that?
I think that the leaks have had an enormous impact. I think that if you look particularly at the State Department cables, the role that those releases played in sparking off what happened in Tunisia and then what happened all the way through 2011, these grassroots democracy movements, obviously the impact has been huge. In terms of what the US government has been arguing, and I would disagree with your last speaker that this is a light story. I think if you've been following the pre-trial hearings, there's been an awful lot of weight to what's being discussed. The US government has made it very difficult for reporters to go to the pre-trial hearings. Actually, the Guardian's been very, very, very good on that, but the New York Times, for example, is an example of a paper that's been particularly bad on it. It wasn't until the public editor of the New York Times sort of shamed the reporters into attending that they did, and this is the very high-profile hearing where what should have been a very high-profile hearing where Bradley was describing the circumstances of his imprisonment. That was, the New York Times didn't go until they were shamed into doing it. In terms of the national security argument, again, if you'd looked at what's been happening in the pre-trial hearings, the US government has tried incredibly hard to stop their own internal assessments of what the impact and the risk assessments of what the release of the information released by WikiLeaks has been. They've tried extremely hard to not disclose that information, and we have to suspect, I guess, that it's not because they've found that there was a huge amount of damage caused.
Well, let me put that point to you, David Schanzer. I think Robert Gates said that the amount of stuff leaked was not really very damaging. I mean, what is your view? Damaging or not damaging?
Well, first of all, the question of criminality doesn't necessarily rest on the impact. I mean, for some of these charges, it does, and so the more extreme ones, aiding the enemy. But the act of gathering information which you were not supposed to have access to and then disclosing it to people who don't have security clearances of any sort was essentially Manning deciding on his own as a junior military officer the information that the entire U.S. government should or should not be disclosing, and that really wasn't for him to do. And of course, the trial hasn't taken place, so these remain allegations. But to me, if those allegations are proven, he's guilty of crimes regardless of whether there was a serious impact to national security or not.
Is that all whistleblowing is wrong. I mean, is that what your point? I mean,
well, we have procedures. We have whistleblower protection acts, and there are procedures by which whistleblowers are empowered to bring information to inspector generals for each agency, can bring information to Congress, and if they do so through the proper procedures, then they have legal protections against retribution. Now, I'm not saying that works, but you're not a protected whistleblower if you take information and bring it that is classified that you think shows some sort of government wrongdoing, and you bring it to the news media. That is not whistleblowing.
Well,
at least in the United States.
Thank you. I don't think you'll agree with that, David. I mean, you're a champion of whistleblowing, aren't you?
Well, obviously, the very fact that the Guardian and the New York Times and the Spiegel in Germany and other international media ran yards and yards of the things that Bradley Manning had disclosed shows that there was an important public interest in doing so. To take a single example, the logs about the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War showed that time and again American troops, and indeed British troops, were in a panic or recklessly, they were shooting up people who simply drove too close to military convoys. And the reality of that had been hushed up. To see those incident logs and to see the cruelty and the recklessness with which civilians were being killed is something that we need to know. So you've got to say, this is a person who revealed some things that the public deserve to know. The situation we have today is that Bradley Manning has admitted, he has pleaded guilty to releasing this information, to passing it in an unauthorized way. So that's where we are. The problem is the US Army and the American government are trying to ramp this up to a level it simply won't bear. Bradley Manning isn't a traitor who signed up with al-Qaeda to help them. That's just ridiculous. Everyone agrees. He is somebody who did what he did for reasons of what he thought were conscience. He didn't do it for money. He didn't do it because he joined al-Qaeda. So his whistleblowing is, on that side of the spectrum, something that he thought should be released. It's not treachery of any kind.
But what about the issue that he may have risked American lives, American forces' lives?
Well, the curious thing is that everybody said blood on his hands when we all started to publish this stuff. And in the intervening 3 years, no one has actually found any concrete example of anyone being killed as a result of those disclosures. Partly because the news media, the New York Times and the Guardian and the others, were pretty careful about what details they actually published, where their informants might have been endangered. We didn't publish that stuff. I think it more or less worked, because if anybody had been killed, we'd have certainly heard about it from the Pentagon.
Well, David Schanzer, coming back to you, I mean, David Leigh makes the point that perhaps Bradley Manning saved lives because the publication of the reckless use of force at checkpoints and other places in Iraq and Afghanistan may have made the United States a bit more careful in dealing with civilians in those countries.
You know, I'm not in a position to assess what the impact was of all the specific leaks, but you know, with respect to the State Department cables, with which I'm most familiar, it's, you know, there's some irony of news organizations who feel very vociferous about protecting their sources, and rightly so. That they don't apply that same logic, for example, to government officials who need to have candid build relationships and have candid exchanges with foreign governments. And the information from the State Department cables, whether they seem to have, you know, major secret information in it or not, what is supposed to be protected is the ability of diplomats to engage in candid conversations with each other, and that was very much violated by the large-scale disclosure. So I can't point to notions where, you know, a person was killed or a military operation was upset, but I do think that this large-scale disclosure did harm to United States foreign relations, our ability to engage in diplomatic relations with other countries, possibly collection of intelligence. So the highest level charges about aiding the enemy, I can't really comment as to whether those are justified. But whether or not any sort of damage to the United States national security and ability to conduct its foreign policy, I'm pretty confident that that did occur due to the WikiLeaks leaks.
No, but there was a kind of filter, wasn't there, which was the New York Times. I mean, in the case of the US publications, I mean, if they had felt it was seriously violating national security, would a sensible, responsible newspaper like the New York Times have published this stuff? I mean, they also published the...
Well, Manning, of course, didn't know that that was going to happen when he released the documents. He just released the documents in their entirety. So what his intentions were and what his actions were, whether or not the New York Times acted responsibly as good journalists and who care about security as well, I have every belief that they did. But the Times just doesn't recognize the notion that government should be able to have candid conversations with each other as a matter of national security. So they just publish those things. But our laws and our executive orders that enable the government to say what is and what is not classified do recognize that as a legitimate reason for withholding of information, and Manning's actions totally ignored that.
Well, Naomi, let me come back to you and the actual treatment of Bradley Manning. I mean, we've mentioned the length of time, but there have also been ways in which he's been humiliated in jail. I mean, is any, and some of it has been declared illegal by a judge. I mean, is there any evidence that his treatment has improved since that judgment?
In the months leading up to March 2011, the details about what was happening to Bradley Manning came out in December 2010, and this is all the detail about the extraordinarily harsh form of solitary confinement he was under, which involved him being asked every 5 minutes whether he was okay every waking hour of his day, and having to respond. And at times that those conditions were made even worse when there were protests outside where he was being housed in Quantico. The guards reacted and actually put him under suicide watch for times. Once this news got out, it sparked off protests in many countries around the world. It sparked off diplomatic protests from countries, and actually including this one. We've had European members of Parliament also making protest about it. This is clearly contrary to basic standards of international law regarding detainment of detainees. Bad even by the standards of US imprisonment, which are pretty bad anyway. I think that given this has happened, and it was condemned by the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture as well, I think it's really debatable whether the US has the moral authority to try Bradley Manning at all, frankly.
Well, David, it seems that Bradley Manning has pleaded guilty on some minor issues connected with it, or minor charges connected with the case. I mean, do you think he will get a decent trial, a fair trial?
Well, it's not minor. I mean, the fact that he's conceded that he was the source of these documents and that he handed them over in an unauthorized way is a pretty big plank of the whole issue that's got to be adjudicated. And I hope that this will now focus on the question of whether he was a traitor or whether he was a whistleblower, and that's a relevant part of the trial.
And that he should just get a very minor sentence for the whistleblowing, you mean?
The problem is, as we've heard, is that really what Bradley Manning did some good, I believe, and also there's a good case that it did some harm, because he did release willy-nilly things that could have been dangerous. And that's not to say that the sort of hysterical and unscrupulous behavior by the US Army in claiming that bin Laden benefited from his material, so he's like really a member of Al-Qaeda. That's just crazy and awful. But I think we have to face the fact that what he did was so uncontrolled, so incontinent, if you like, that it had dangers as well as virtues. And probably, well, Bradley Manning's been severely punished already. He spent 3 years in the brig, being, as we've heard, very harshly treated at times. I think he's certainly been punished enough.
What do you think to that, David Schanzer? Has he been punished enough? If he just gets a relatively minor sentence for admitting to whistleblowing in an unauthorized manner without going through the procedures that you mentioned earlier, would that be enough? Would you be happy with that?
Well, I'm certainly not sitting in judgment here on this program of Bradley Manning, and I have no defense or I'm just as outraged as your other guests about the unnecessarily harsh treatment for a nonviolent offender. I think if you look at other prosecutions for leaking classified information, many of them do get a stiff sentence, but a life sentence is very extraordinary under these circumstances for that kind of activity. I will say, though, that members of the armed forces are held to different kinds of standards regarding their conduct than civilians. Manning had certain duties as a member of the Army to uphold certain conduct, so he might get might be entitled, or it might be subject to a greater level, higher sentence because of that. But I think something more in the 10 to 15-year range was certainly probably a more likely outcome than time served or a life sentence. Somewhere in between is probably what's going to happen.
David Leigh, let me come back to you about the whole issue of whistleblowing. Julian Assange was shown there saying that this is a war on whistleblowers. I mean, do you think that Bradley Manning's case will rather frighten people off and who might be potential whistleblowers, or will it have the opposite effect of sort of encouraging more people to come forward?
Well, the sheer audacity of and the scale of the leak in Bradley Manning's case has provoked a countervailing reaction from the United States government, which is extreme. Very angry, very extreme, and they're determined to grind Bradley Manning into the ground in the hope of terrifying others and terrifying
but will it work, do you think? Will it terrify others?
Well, I think
let's assume he gets a life sentence, just take the worst case. Well,
I think to an extent it will, but we have to remember that Bradley Manning got himself caught, in fact, because he confided in other people in a way. He got himself arrested, and not everybody is going to be as disturbed, as confused, as talkative as he was. The fact is that what underlies all this is a change in the nature of information. And that's what terrifies governments all over the world, actually. We're in a world, an electronic world, since the internet came into being, in which huge databases are being created. When they're created, they are bound to be leaked. Information becomes very slippery. And the story about the Bradley Manning leaks is this was a giant databases that the US Army had compiled that could be copied and leaked in a flash. And that's what frightens everybody, because that is the nature of information in the modern world.
Well, does it mean that people will have to sort of parcel up their information and not put everything on one CD or one database and have to make it harder for leakers?
I think electronic security is an illusion, and I think there are a lot of hackers who would agree with me.
Well, Naomi Colvin, do you think that he should be at least sentenced on what he's now confessed, or are you saying that he should get away scot-free?
My sympathies on this are very clear. I think that yes, he suffered enough, and the wrongs that have been done. I think at this point, at some point during the pre-trial hearings, charges should have been dismissed. I mean, this will be, whatever happens at the end of this hearing, will be inevitably appealed and probably appealed again. So we're still, I believe, midway through a very long process. I do think that, in addition to what David rightly says about the US taking on whistleblowers and people in the national security establishment who are brave enough to say what's going on and point out either wrongdoing and inefficiencies and human rights abuses. In addition to that, I think we should also say that the US is coming down very, very hard on people who are exercising their democratic rights via electronic means. And we, as well as looking at what's happening to Bradley Manning, we should remember what's happening to Jeremy Hammond and what's happening to Barrett Brown. These, in their way, and what happened to Aaron Schwartz, right, these in their ways are equally disproportionate. We're coming to the end.
We certainly should remember the Bradley Manning case, and we'll come on to the other ones perhaps later on. Thank you very much, David Schanzer from North Carolina, Duke University, for being with us. Thank you, David Leigh. Thank you, Naomi Colvin. And thank you all for watching. We'll be back again the same time next week.